We talked earlier about geopolitics and whatnot, and you brought me back a bit to that, Bob, with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the regulation side on it. But that's a real issue. When you think about where's the growth coming from, you know, the developed world, a little slower growth, emerging world, so you go there for growth. But then you run into other issues, including geopolitical, that you need to face. And I know, John, you had some thoughts, and Eileen on that. So
yeah, the Chemical Corporation, which is one of the boards on which I sit, has an operation joint venture in Kazakhstan. And with all the activity that was taking place in the Ukraine relative to Russia, obvious concern to management of the board is what is the risk of further infiltration of Russians into Kazakhstan, and as well what could happen to our particular asset, which is a very valuable asset, not only currently but long term. And so what was really comforting in all of that, not that you could ever be comforted, was the obvious interaction, close interaction that our CEO has with Kazatomprom, the head of Kazatomprom, who's now the number 2 or 3 person, matter of fact, in Kazakhstan. And we provided them with, with technical support, with a lot of original design, feasibility, and everything else like that. So this is not just us shipping money to Kazakhstan and then expecting to get a return. In addition, the point I was making to you earlier, we've always felt this relationship was really, really strong, but what was very good was when the whole board went over to Kazakhstan. And we met with our joint venture partners. We were not able to meet with the Prime Minister, Premier, I think it was, or President, I'm sorry. But the head of he spoke Russian, the head of Kazatomprom, and he said, you were the first one who's been here in 12 years, first board who's been here in 12 years. And you could see the extent to which it was very important to them that we felt it was important enough for us in our relationship to come over and do that. So I encourage, it's one obvious message, I encourage everybody to get out of the boardrooms and get out to the operations.
It's obviously a critical area, being on the ground, and I think the bit about trusted partner, you need to make sure you have someone on the ground you know and trust would be a critical thing. I want to just shift a little bit back to the broader regulation front. So, you know, I said it's an emerging risk. It's not new. We've been busy working on the compliance aspect, but more from a strategic front. So we know, you know, the regulation, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of it's coming. Bob, you said, you know, Dodd-Frank, the volumes, whatnot. But so how do boards deal with that strategically? How do they change? How do they try to, you know, rather than react, how do they get ahead of it? To me, that's an important strategic issue for boards around regulation. Thoughts from panelists?
Let me try. I think that there's great sophistication in doing so for financial services businesses. In other words, they have been regulated for many years, or pharma, or, you know, companies that literally operate in the regulated realm. I think, you know, they tend to have risk committees, they tend to have expertise on their board around regulation or policy. I think commercial companies that are dealing with, you know, an SEC thing here or there, but they're not otherwise regulated, it's a little harder. And I don't want to confuse anyone. Most of the Dodd-Frank stuff is for banks. I mean, or other, what's the right word? The significant entities, you know. But I mean, I think sophistication is already embedded in most financial services companies, whether it's insurance, banks, or otherwise. I just think it's tougher for the up-and-coming small company, you know, in a growth mode, or startups or whatever. I think that's a whole different world. They're very naive about regulation oftentimes.
Any other?
Well, yeah, again, I think there are people who can help you. And other than, I think the best advice I ever got was it doesn't pay to argue with the regulator most of the time. I mean, they have you know, it's like in the old days when bond raters, you always knew there was nothing in it for them to hear about good news, right? But I think it's the same with regulators. You know, they feel passionate about what they're supposed to be doing. And the main thing is, you know, you got to work with these people. There's absolutely no way they're going away. There was never a regulator started that was stopped. It's there forever. And you just have to find a way to build a relationship with these people where they think that you are being straight and open and transparent with them. And basically when that's developed, you're at least going to have somebody was talking about earlier, the benefit of the doubt. And I think we have to try and build that. It's never going to be perfect. But I think it's important, as you say, Bob, for people who don't deal with regulators on a routine, everyday basis, to have some program of interaction and communication with the regulator on a more routine basis, so that when things arise, they have a relationship they can milk for goodwill.
So, so a great tip in terms of managing the relationship. Don't fight City Hall. You need to. It's a reality. You need to work within that framework. And the other thing that I have seen a number of organizations in terms of the seniority of the position that deals, the management position that deals with this, used to be way down the bowels of the organization. Much more significant role in terms of responsibilities and whatnot.
And most of them now want to talk to the chairman of the audit committee.
Yep. Right.
So for those, yes, well, that, yes, for sure.
So we're getting close, and I do want to shift now back to the board. We've talked about emerging risks in a broad sense. Now, so what's a board meant to do to really do a good job around this? And I guess the first question to the panelists is, your recommendation. How do you get the organization and the board to think out of the box, to make sure you actually look at all those risks that are perhaps low probability but clearly high impact? How do you actually engage in that? What's the board meant to do?
Ask questions.
My experience in just about every front is that it's really, really good to have people who have deep industry expertise and knowledge that they are maintaining on a current basis on your board. The boards work together. There are no little silos or no little islands unto themselves, but so we really kind of rely on each other a great deal in understanding what's happening. And I find their insights to be particularly helpful, whether it's in the telecom industry or mining or the nuclear industry itself. And that's a very important attribute of the boards that I look for. And I think that helps an awful lot in understanding not only current issues, but as well emerging issues. Because by staying current, they and others around the board table are going to some of the conferences that are out there and really keeping on top and meeting people and talking about what is going on in the industry. So very, very useful.
In terms of competency and skill sets on the board, in terms of, I guess back to my point earlier on, oversight, but insight. So, something more that we want from our directors in terms of dealing with these kind of issues. What about the scenario planning? And I've seen a lot of scenario planning. I'm never quite sure how effective it is. It's presented, but how do you make scenario? What have you seen in terms of scenario planning that works out well for the board that our audience might take away from this?
Well, I guess the best example I have was when a number of years ago when the shipping company had an expert from Shell come in and work with us, and it was really, I think as you talked about, Bob, it was really working between the outside expert and management, because the board of directors don't have, except John, for some of those very specific people who have deep industry knowledge, we're amateurs in most of these businesses on whose boards we sit. And we need management to be engaged in the discussion. And if management and the scenario planners can come up with some of these things, boards can ask great questions, they can bring their experience, but it's really important that the main interaction in building these scenarios that have plausibility are attached firmly to management.
Any other reactions, John?
Well, again, in the regulated area of financial institutions, there are a number of tests that the regulator asks us to run, and these are not something that are done in a day. These can take weeks to do. But the point being that when you look at the results, you say, gee, that's pretty interesting. When you kind of go through it, there was one called DCAT, or Dynamic Capital Adequacy Testing. And there's another one, the concept of living wills, that is going on around now as to how the organization would survive another deep financial crisis, and what would you sell off, what would you do with this, that, how would you move the pieces around. We said when we saw that document, which is some 180 to 200 pages, again, for a life insurance company, we said, that's mandatory reading for every brand new board member. And that's part of the orientation program now. So very useful and helpful.
At the board, you're saying, in terms of getting at merging risk, do you actually have a topic which is called emerging risk? And Eileen, I thought there was something about a blue sky session, but is it baked into the risk register, or do you actually break it out and spend some time and talk about it? What have you seen? And Alistair, I know you have some comments too.
Well, I think that for boards, I mean, we talk about regulatory problems. They're forced to spend so much of their time dealing with things that are, everyday issues that, where boxes have to be checked and things have to be looked at. But at some point, they have to be freed up to actually talk about things that are way out on the horizon and to try and bring some of those things closer into the strategic discussion. If you don't force yourselves to have that discussion, I think you're really shortchanging the board.
And Alistair, in the world you live in,
I talked a little bit earlier, and it was probably because it was a pretty big challenge to even get us to enterprise risk management within the university system, that felt it was important to separate the day-to-day ongoing risks from the emerging ones. And I think that enabled us to set aside time that was that blue skying. It came out of the risk register and the examination of those heat profiles, but it actually put us into a space where you were free to talk about the things you wanted to talk about. I do want to pick up on an observation from John, though, that made me sit back. And obviously, university boards have a different constitution. We have a very different makeup. We usually have internal members of the board, staff, faculty, and students, which bring all kinds of challenges. But the fascinating thing is that I think we have avoided having industry experts on the board because we have faculty. And so I don't know a board that actually has an education expert for a university on the board, or a series of them, who would have that in-depth distance piece. And that may be worth taking on board for some of the people listening who are on university boards, to question whether that is indeed something you want to have. Because when we have those discussions about emerging risks, the board will turn to the faculty, who are chosen from the faculty and are not necessarily in the space to be able to talk comparatively at all about what's going on in the industry. So that was it was a good take home for me from today's session, maybe for others.
Good message there in terms of it's good to look outside in, as opposed to an inside out view on that.